couldn't stand to wait any longer to see how this shopping trip goes. So we're going to go straight into chapter 6, which is called Kevin Goes Shopping. Kevin galloped towards the edge of the roof, flapping his wings as fast as they would go. The pigeons watched enviously as he jumped over the railings and soared into the sky. Then they all ducked as he came swooping back right over their coop. Kevin had never flown into a town before, and he was very excited. He whirled around the outside of Max's flat and went diving down until his hooves almost touched the water. He nearly collided with the pair of guinea pigs who had made a sail for their hutch from a plastic bag and was steering towards the park, but he pulled up just in time and went flapping off up the flooded high street. Max held on tight to the towel he had tied around Kevin's neck and waved to everyone they passed. Some people were paddling about on their airbeds and canoes. Others were camped upon rooftops or watching from high windows. Max had expected them to be amazed when they saw a boy on a white fat pony go flying past, but they didn't really seem too surprised. He soon finds out why. There was a whole list of surprising things to see in Bumbleford that morning, and fat flying ponies didn't even make the top 3. Gordon had been right about the storm. It had woken up all sorts of strange creatures who don't usually come near places where ordinary people live. Water monsters, which had been washed up out of the lakes in the wild wet hills, had come slithering into the town. They coiled themselves like snakes around the sunken lampposts, and they ate soggy cakes which were floating about out of the bakery. And a herd of brightly coloured seahorses had come swimming up the River Bumble from the sea, and they were racing each other up and down the high street. They got very excited when Kevin flew over. A crowd of giggly mermaids had come up the river too. They had always wondered what a human town looked like, and now that Bumbleford was underwater, they had the perfect chance to explore. When Kevin and Max looked down through the clear water, they could see the mermaids swimming in and out of the flooded shops, helping themselves to clothes and shoes. They didn't have any feet to wear the shoes on, of course. They just put them on their heads like hats. A giant octopus had found its way into the shoe shop too. It was trying on 4 pairs of very trendy trainers. Kevin landed on top of the clock tower near the supermarket and folded his wings. Max hopped off his back. "Stay here," he said. "I'll be back in a minute." "Custard creams," said Kevin happily. Max scrambled down the clock face, took a deep breath, and jumped off the number 6 into the waves. It was very strange to be underwater, swimming past all the familiar shops. The sunlight came down in silvery fingers through the wave tops and tickled the shop signs. Max peered in through the window of his mum's hairdressing salon. It was usually very quiet, because most people had their hair done at the bigger salon at the other end of the high street. Mum worried about it. She was always saying that if she didn't start getting more customers soon, the salon might have to close. Max wished she could see it today. Although it was full of water, it was also full of mermaids. They were milling about inside, admiring the photographs of all the fancy hairstyles which were pinned upon the walls. Some were putting curlers in their hair and opening bottles of dye, which made huge clouds in the water like multicoloured squid ink. A few saw Max looking at them and gave him a wave. They're really making the most of that. Max had been staring at them for so long that he'd run out of air. He swam back to the surface, took another huge gulp and dived down again, aiming for the supermarket. The supermarket was surprisingly busy too. Quite a lot of people had caught, like Max's family, without much food in the house when the flood arrived. So those who owned snorkels or aqualungs were fetching supplies for the rest. Mrs. Oliveira, the supermarket manager, stood at the door in her diving suit, holding a board where she'd written in waterproof ink, "Everything free today." That was a stroke of luck, thought Max, because he had completely forgotten to bring any money with him. The second big breath he had taken before he jumped off the clock was already starting to run out, and bits of it kept escaping in little bubbles from the corners of his mouth. So he grabbed a basket from the pile beside Mrs. Oliveira and swam quickly along the aisles straight to the biscuit section. He knew his way because the biscuit section was the best bit of the supermarket. Lots of mermaids were gathered there, opening packets of biscuits and trying them, but they were mostly going for the chocolate ones. And lots of packets of Kevin's favourite were floating around untouched. Max gathered them up and wedged them into his basket. He was getting ready to leave when he noticed a twin pack of custard creams just behind a hungry mermaid. "Excuse me," he said without thinking as he reached for it. But that was a mistake, because the last breath he had been holding came out with the words, and some water rushed in. Snatching the biscuits in one hand and towing his full basket with the other, he swam out of the shop and kicked his way straight back to the surface. "I did it," he shouted as he climbed back onto the clock tower roof. He started taking packets of biscuits out of the basket and putting them into his shopping bags, ready to hang them over Kevin's back. He thought how pleased Mum and Dad would be with him when he went home with fresh supplies. Then he wondered what they say when the fresh supplies turned out to just be biscuits. "I'm going to have to go back down," he told Kevin. "Mum says we need a balanced diet." Kevin was a bit confused by that because he thought biscuits, and then more than one biscuit, was a balanced diet, but he nodded very wisely as if he understood, and he watched while Max took another huge deep breath and dived again. Max swam through the supermarket, grabbing apples, bananas, tins of beans, and a big bag of frozen broccoli. The fresh bread had all been ruined by the water, but he found some sliced loaves in bags which looked waterproof. A huge plastic bottle with oranges on the label drifted by, and he grabbed that too because he liked orange juice. Outside, in the warm sunshine, Kevin was exploring the clock tower roof. There were sculptures of a lion and unicorn on the very top, and he was a bit scared of them at first until he worked out that they weren't real. He went and stood beside them. He tried to copy the lion's brave pose, and he made faces at the unicorn. Kevin had met unicorns before, and they'd all been horrid show-offs. When he looked down at the supermarket again, he saw Max pop to the surface with another basket full of food. He gave a welcoming sort of whinny and made ready to flap down and say hello, but just then he noticed something else. Zooming through the water towards Max was something dark, something with a black triangular fin. A shark! Kevin had never actually seen a shark, but he had heard about them. They had always sounded really scary, with their pointy teeth and their big black fins and their slimy tentacles. Or was that an octopus? But whatever. He didn't want a horrible shark eating his friend. Brave as any lion, Kevin launched himself off the top of the clock tower and dived towards the oncoming shark. It was a really big one, and he was a bit frightened of it, but he made himself keep going. "Leave Max alone," he whinnied, and he crash-landed on top of the fearsome fish when it was just a few metres from Max. Splash! The shark came to pieces, and all the pieces swam off in different directions, laughing madly. It turned out it wasn't a shark at all. It was a load of naughty little web-footed monkeys who had been swimming along in a clump, holding a cardboard cutout fin to make people think that they were a shark. They were sea monkeys, smelly, shouty, mischievous little creatures who hatched out of seaweed which washed up on the shores of the outermost west. They usually lived in big gangs on the rocky beaches there, but now they had decided to come and have some fun in Bumbleford. They scrambled onto nearby buildings or the tops of lampposts and jeered at Kevin. One tried to steal the basket of food which Max had just brought up from the supermarket, but Kevin wasn't having that. He took off, shook himself dry in midair and swooped low over the water so that Max could grab his hooves as he went by. He carried Max and the basket up to the top of the clock tower, and Max draped the shopping bags back over Kevin, filled them and towelled himself dry. Max had been planning to swim back down and return the baskets to the pile outside the supermarket, but it didn't seem like a good idea with all those naughty little monkeys around. So he stacked them on one side, and inside the other he dropped them off the clock tower, hoping that they would sink down to roughly the right place. Then he slung the bag over Kevin's back and they started to fly home. They were both feeling happy and triumphant. Max was looking forward to telling his parents and neighbours about his adventures underwater and all the strange visitors that the flood had brought to Bumbleford. One of the loaves he had found turned out to be all soggy inside the bag, and the orange juice wasn't just orange at all. It was super concentrated, fruity, fresh bubble bath. But he still knew that Mum and Dad would probably be pretty pleased. As for Kevin, he was mostly looking forward to the biscuits, but he knew that he had been terribly brave in saving Max from the shark, even if it had turned out to be sea monkeys. He had thought it was a shark, and that's what counted. He decided that he should award himself a medal, but he wasn't sure where you get medals from. So he decided to award himself some extra biscuits instead. They were just flying over Max's school when they heard a voice from below, and it was shouting, "Help." That's the end of the chapter. See you soon.